Hey guys, Josh from College Football Nerds. Week one, big time matchups. Here we've got USC versus LSU doing a game preview. For those that don't know, unfortunately, Daniel has been in the hospital since this past weekend. There have been a lot of thoughts and prayers shared. A lot of people have reached out to us via Twitter and other means. We really appreciate it. I think Daniel is on the mend. I talked to him earlier today, so fingers crossed he'll be home soon. In the meantime, I don't have quite access to all the production tools we're used to. But we did a live show on Monday night where we went over game previews. You can watch the live show, but if you want to, I went ahead and cut it up, and we put a video here doing our preview of the LSU versus Southern Cal game, week one. Here we go. USC versus LSU, to me, is one of the most fascinating games just from the aspect of I think these teams are not who we think they are. When you look at LSU, as a football team in 2024, the thing that I've heard from a number of people is there's this open question of whether you can win a football game without a defensive tackle. And, it's kind of true. The guys they bring back, Jacoby and Guillory has been a reserve player for them for a while. Frankly, is not a guy they would probably like to be starting. Jalen Lee, Braden Swimson, these are not guys that you typically want to have starting on the defensive line in the SEC. They do have some transfers from depth that they're trying to shore it up. But by and large, you look kind of all the way through the defense, there are major question marks. Zion Alexander has been shaky. Major Burns and Sage Ryans have both been very shaky at safety for this defense. And so the question is, I think in everybody's mind, with a change on the defensive side of the football, bringing in new defensive coordinator Blake Baker, who comes down from Missouri, is he going to be able to work wonders at LSU the way he did at Missouri? And is LSU going to be able to score enough points to outscore a USC team that has been a scoring machine for as long as everybody can remember under Lincoln Riley? As somebody just said in the chats, first one to 114 wins, ? Right? And I think it's interesting because I do think there's a very fair point to be made that LSU's defense probably still isn't going to be fantastic. They may be better. It's hard not to be better than they were last year when they were absolutely terrible. Again, I was just giving points per drive, and if you look at LSU defensively, points per drive allowed, they were 119th in the country, 2.8 points per drive allowed. Almost a field goal. And what's actually fascinating is they, like on long drives, they were 2.81 points per drive offensively, 2.81 points per drive allowed defensively. They were almost as bad defensively as they were good offensively. It's just terrible. And the thing is, you can be a lot better and you can still be bad. And so the flip side, though, I think is just where USC is as a football team. And this is where I think people probably, at least in my mind, I don't know that there's been enough analysis given, because I went back and I watched the Holiday Bowl to see Miller Moss and see where he's at as a quarterback. And where I really felt like, and especially in that bowl game, I felt like USC's receivers were excellent. I thought Miller Moss was just okay. And I know he threw for over 300 yards, 5 touchdowns. I get that, but there's multiple things that make an offense work. And what I saw from Moss was a guy, he looked about like his recruiting ranking. He is a solid Power 5 starter. He's certainly not Caleb Williams. In my view, from what I saw and where I think they'll be, he's far and away the least talented quarterback that Lincoln Riley has worked with dating back to prior to Baker Mayfield. And I think it's a bit fascinating because I do think there's a good amount of talent at the wide receiver positions. I think Zachariah Branch is a special player. I think he still needs to grow into being a more complete receiver. In some ways, I think Jacoby Lane's actually a more complete receiver at this point. But when you consider where LSU is as a defense, as we were discussing in week one, yeah, the secondary is shaky, but the front seven is the thing that's a massive question mark. And the interior defensive line is the big issue. So I think this game for USC is way more about Woody Marks. It's way more about that offensive line. Again, like a lot of other places, combination of developed players and big-time recruits that are just trying to stop in a roles. They only have really 2 returning linemen. And the question, I think, is going to be whether or not they can get, get that running game going. And I'm going to take a moment to have sort of a divergence there to talk a little bit in the weeds, as we did in some of our previews, about the RPO and the way USC operates. So let's rewind a long time ago, 2018. Shout out on the channel if you were around watching our videos in 2018, because we're even older than that. The RPO had really taken off. Really, the early days of the RPO, 2013, 2014, 2015, Gus Malzahn, Hugh Freeze, that era, that RPO was about shot plays. It was, they'd fake a receiver screen or fake a run, and they would throw over the top. And at that point in time, it was actually pretty rudimentary, a lot of what was being implemented, and defenses really had no idea how to read or react to it. So those shot plays were almost hyper effective. But then they expanded that, and they really leaned into the RPO read stuff. So where Alabama in their 2018 run, when they played Clemson, was this offense that was almost completely geared on RPO zone run passes, meaning they would take deep shots into the seams, or they would take shots past the linebackers, or they would zone run to their running backs like Josh Jacobs. There are a lot of big names there. Damian Harris, Brian Robinson. I still go back and look at it. The 2018 Alabama team, in my opinion, having if you go back and look at their 2 or 3 deep, probably the greatest collection of offensive talent maybe in modern football. No offense to the 2019 LSU team, which has a legitimate argument for having better starters. But when you combine offensive line, running back depth, which I guess that team went with Harris, Gore, Brian Robinson, Josh Jacobs, all on the same team. Najee Harris was on that team. Wide receiver was, everybody they had, and Jalen Waddle, who didn't even play. Crazy team. But they were locked into the RPO. And they were locked into the RPO specifically where they would have a zone run. And a zone run means you're not attacking a gap. The linemen have zone responsibilities, and the running back is stretching the play, looking for an opportunity to cut back or waiting for the linebackers to not get to a gap and go through it. And zone run on one side so that the lineman can be held at the line of scrimmage, and then a deep passing attack over the top where they would have to pull it and throw over a linebacker or over a safety. And the whole game that was being played there at that time was that most safeties were still somewhat keying run to pass, meaning if they showed run or they played action, the safeties would bite down, and then you would throw over the top, and that would be extremely explosive because once the safety stepped forward, if you had great receivers, it was easy to get behind the defense and it was an instant touchdown. But what started happening, and I really do think Venables really broke the door open on this, is teams started kind of giving up the run and just saying, we're going to never let you pass deep. And the safeties stopped keying run pass around that 2018, 2019 mark. And ever since then, they have played sit back and float and deal with a run when it crosses the line of scrimmage. Everybody on this chat, I guarantee you, and this is pipe up if you're guilty of this, has complained about the safeties on their team in the last 5 years and talked about how their safeties are just terrible. And the reason for that is safeties are not allowed to react at the play because of the RPO. If they react at the play, they risk giving up deep coverage and an easy touchdown. And it doesn't matter how many good plays you have in a row. If you bust one coverage deep, it's a touchdown. Nothing else matters. You can screw up a great first and second down with one mistake on third down. And so Clemson, what they did is they said, we'll run a 6-7 man box between the 20s. Again, they had a generational defensive line. So most teams have done this more like a 7-man box, but they did it with a 6. And they said, we can get away with it. We can handle the run just well enough, and we're going to take away the deep shot. This is where Lincoln Riley and USC comes in, because at Oklahoma, the big innovation that Lincoln Riley put in was to transition from a zone run based system to a power run system. If you look at the great Oklahoma teams, and we talked about this in the 2018 playoff, actually, that Oklahoma team, Kyler Murray was phenomenal. They had a great passing game. But the thing that made Oklahoma so special is they were actually rushing for over 8 yards a carry. Over 8 yards a carry going into the playoffs. And they did that because with everybody playing back, linebackers and safeties taking a step back, trying to play back in coverage, with the zone run scheme, you could kind of handle it, right? Because it floats around, it stretches out, and once the ball was handed off, you could then move up. But in a power run scheme, those guards and those tackles, part of it is they're going to pull, right? And so they're going to pull, and you're not going to attack a zone. You're going to attack a gap. It's going to be A gap run, B gap run, C gap run. If you're unfamiliar, starting with the center, the gaps are labeled sequentially A, B, C, outside the center, outside the guard, outside the tackle. D, if there's a tight end, outside the tight end. And power runs are called to a gap with a pulling guard or tackle. Well, the thing is, in a normal defensive scheme, the thing that usually you want to happen is you want the linebackers to shoot those gaps. You want the linebackers, when there's a pulling guard or something, the linebackers are going to shoot the gap, and they're either going to try to come back and makes a backside play on the running back, or they'll shoot the mesh point if there's like if the quarterback's holding it for like an RPO. But if you're teaching the linebackers and safeties to play back, if you're teaching them to play on their heels, to say we're not going to give up the deep pass, well, now when a player pulls, they can't afford to crash. They can't afford to crash through that hole. And so Riley just took a step away and said, can we be power? Can we push? Can we pull guys and not get 3 yards downfield in time for me to throw the football so that I can run that RPO play with a power component? And even if it's not part of the RPO itself, I at least constantly have the threat of it, because if I can, and this is where I think, for example, Bill O'Brien went completely wrong in Alabama. He didn't run much RPO, at least much vertical RPO. And so teams, safeties, and defenses got to play more honest. But if you can be devastating with the RPO, if you can be effective, if you can attack them with the RPO and you can force the secondary to play back, you can force the linebackers to play back, now your power run game opens up because they're not able to shoot gaps. They have to be flat-footed. They pull. By the time you go forward, it's too late. You can't get through that gap and get to the running back. And because you're flat-footed, when the pulling guard hits the line of scrimmage on the other side, he's hitting, he may blow up the defensive tackle and hit a linebacker flat-footed, and you blow the hole open. And that's everything USC does. Everything they do is based on the run game, because if they can get that run game going, then you have to start walking up your safeties and linebackers. Then you're going to start having real issues with big shot plays because your guys are out of position. So the interplay between having the threat of the RPO passing and run is important. And again, like I always love the feedback, guys. Let me know if you find this interesting. That's what makes Lincoln Riley's scheme so special, is how well he marries the two. And then he has a million wrinkles off it. Every RPO play is going to have a run. It's going to have a power run version. It's going to have a pass. It's going to probably have a screen component. And it's going to have some sort of razzle-dazzle, jet sweep, something else. He also tries to keep in mind horizontal plays because that holds your linebackers out. And so in this game, coming back to this game, when you have defensive tackles at LSU that are really weak and suspect, I really think it's going to come down on the offensive side of the ball to whether USC can run inside. If they can run for 5, 6, 7 yards a carry early in this game, you're going to immediately know that USC is going to put up a lot of points. And I've already said that I don't think Miller Moss, at least personally, is going to be the dude, but he doesn't have to be. If they can run the ball well enough, they're going to make LSU be less than sound or less than good defensively in the back end. And it doesn't matter that I think LSU has improvements in defensive coordinator. There's not so much you can do about that. And now let's flip it over a little bit, because I think this is the part that's harder for me to discuss, which is why I focus mainly on the first half, but also an interesting conversation. On the defensive side of the ball, USC is turning over a lot of players. And the big thing that they're really relying on this year is a lot of transfers and key positions. And I could go around Oregon State, UCLA in the secondary, Vandy starter on the defensive line, which doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. And they're trying to shore up a unit that has been objectively bad for a few years. And my opinion on these Lincoln Riley teams is I don't really think it's going to matter so much who the defensive coordinator is. My suspicion, and I had this suspicion years ago with Gus Malzahn teams when he was a dominant coach in the SEC, or at least one of the better coaches. A lot of these up-tempo, aggressive offensive systems are built around a lot of clean reps in practice. They are really focused on getting as many opportunities as they can for their offense. They don't want a lot of contact for the offensive players. They don't want, they don't want their offensive players to get used to having bad timing. So a lot of times they'll run it and they'll basically tell the defense to let them go. They do a lot of, bad on good. And I think what ends up happening when you do that is you don't really do a good job of letting your defense practice and learn. Because as I had a coach tell me one time, defense is about reaction and contact. And as a defense, you never know what the offensive play is. You have to have your play call, have something go live, and learn how to react to that play call in live action, and then make contact with the offense at the line of scrimmage or at the point of the tackle and make the tackle. If you're not allowed to make contact, if you're not allowed to have to react in such a way that you disrupt the timing of the offense, because again, what ends up happening is Lincoln Riley wants that offense to get in their head the perfect clockwork rhythm of how the play is supposed to go. The defense effectively isn't practicing, and I think that's what we're seeing at USC is they kind of really hamstring their defense. And so, they have, if you get guys like Muhammad or Barry Alexander, you get transfers like Akalai Arnold. I don't know how much it's going to matter if they continue to coach that way. But, I think they could be a step better. And I will say this for LSU offensively, it's an interesting question to me because if there's one thing that you want to nitpick, it's the fact that you lose Jaden Daniels. Look, LSU has one of the best offensive lines in college football, period. Their offensive line is phenomenal. Left tackle is Campbell, right tackle is Emory Jones. They may both be first-round draft picks. A few years ago when they started Jalen Daniels, let me make sure I'm saying that right. The thing that I think made them start him when they weren't sure who they had was the fact that they had these young, at that time, freshman offensive tackles on both sides of the line, and they were getting a lot of pass rush. And Jalen Daniels was a check down king, and a lot of LSU fans were upset about that. And we kept saying, look, they're starting him because he's a mobile quarterback, and being a check down king when you're getting pressure is not a bad thing. And what you saw through 2022, late in 2022, and all through 2023, that offensive line started to gel, and those young players matured. And as he had more time, Jalen Daniels was able to open up and throw further and further down the field. And suddenly you realize the quarterback that he could be or was. But in that, I think a lot of people miss that he was a 3,000-yard career rusher. And we've tweeted about before with Daniels. Daniels was probably, far and away the most effective running quarterback in the modern era of the SEC. He's, from a yard per play perspective, I believe he led all rushers in the SEC last year from a yardage standpoint. I believe he was second in the conference, and I can just pull it up right now rather than saying it off the cuff. Sorry, I need to take some water and reset for a second. Yards per play, Jaden Daniels led the conference at 8.4 yards per carry at all positions. Yards per game, Jaden Daniels was second in the conference at 94 yards per game at all positions. He was a phenomenal rusher. He had the highest yard per carry average of any quarterback, better than Tim Tebow, better than Cam Newton in the modern era of the SEC. And I think that's the thing, if anything, that maybe is a little bit of a question mark in my mind, because when I saw LSU play Wisconsin, and they played him with Neighbors, at least kind of for a half. They played him with Brian Thomas Jr., who looks phenomenal for the Jaguars right now. Nussmeier had phenomenal statistics in that game, yet they still stalled several times. And it was a little weird to see that, but it makes perfect sense because Daniel's ability to run essentially made defenses were either playing with a hand tied behind their back because they were having to spy or play containment. They couldn't rush the passer. Or when they blitzed, when they got pressure, Daniels would take off and run and get a first down. Why did LSU beat Alabama 2 years ago? Because Jaden Daniels tore off a 40-yard run in the fourth quarter when Alabama brought the house. And that's just not something they're going to be able to do with Garrett Nussmeier. So I think it will be interesting to see how LSU transitions from a team that has had probably the most dynamic player in the country for a year, maybe two. Again, a runner who, I'm telling you statistically, you go back and look at it, check my math, he was every bit the runner Lamar Jackson was in college. And people may scoff at that, but he was. He's not as quick as Lamar, but as far as a downhill runner, he was darn near as effective. And now you transition to a more traditional offense with a quarterback that is not very mobile, and you're going to have to be a more run or pass type scheme and system. And I think it's going to be a lot harder for LSU as a result of that, because teams are going to be able to play them much more honestly, right? When you talk about the RPO, there's RPOs where you're faking to the running back or you're throwing. And then there are RPO schemes where it is a zone read RPO with a handoff, a keep, or a pass option, which is where LSU's been. And that's just almost impossible to defend from a numerical standpoint. And so it sort of takes a whole level out of that offense necessarily. And it's just going to be really interesting to see how LSU does it. Now, I will see, at least for my part, I still think, on the balance of things, I think LSU is probably the better team here. But I do think, guys, I think this is darn close. The total over-under right now is 64.5. The spread is 4.5. I'm going to take LSU, but I'm not going to take them by the point spread. It will not surprise me if USC wins this game. I think it's going to be a shootout. They have this in the 30s. I'm going to say, LSU wins this one just for the sake of argument. I'm going to say LSU wins at 34-31. But, I think USC, as they gel this year, as they get in the new quarterback, it's going to be interesting to see them in the Big Ten, because one of the big things that I think is going to happen is we like to ding USC for their defense. We like to talk about how they're a one-dimensional club, and I know a lot of teams in the Big Ten are kind of licking their chops and saying USC is going to be exposed. But I'm going to tell you, USC is also a much better offensive football team in terms of dynamic skill talent than almost anybody in the Big Ten. Ohio State certainly can run with them. Michigan, in their own way, can, though they're not built to be as explosive. Penn State, though, teams like that, Penn State does not have the skill players USC has. They just don't. They do not have this wide receiver talent. And most of the teams in the Big Ten otherwise, just full honesty, they do not have the wide receivers USC does, and they would any day of the week trade for Miller Moss at quarterback. And so I think there's going to be a lot of teams in the Big Ten that are going to get kind of exposed in the other way. They're not used to playing teams that have the kind of speed and explosiveness that USC has on the offensive side of the football. And yeah, they're going to put up maybe more points than Big Ten teams are used to. But I think there's this assumption that USC is going to run into a brick wall with Big Ten defenses. And, we've said this for years. Really good offensive teams don't tend to do that. They tend to kind of score regardless, especially with a coach like Lincoln Riley. And so they're probably going to lose to some teams they shouldn't. But I think they're going to beat a lot of teams that people are not expecting them to beat. And I think there are probably some teams like, the Iowas of the Big Ten that have gotten exposed to Ohio States and Michigan. And I think they're going to get exposed to teams like USC and Oregon. And I think USC is kind of sort of flying under the radar as a team that really has the potential, in my mind, to upset some people this year. Playing Notre Dame, playing Michigan, playing Penn State. I'm going to go on record right now, and I think they're going to beat at least one of those three. I think they're going to do it. And they may get blown out in the other two, but they have the offensive talent to win shootouts. And I think this LSU game is such an interesting one because it is such a one-sided affair from LSU's side and how good they are offensively and how bad they are defensively. And weirdly, I almost think it's to their advantage because I think in week one with a new quarterback, I don't think USC is going to click well enough to keep pace. And I think LSU has just enough guys like Harold Perkins that can make a negative play and blow up a drive that it's going to get them that win, 34-31 or what have you. And I note, by the way, 34-31 is not a game in the 40s, and that's consistent with the point I'm making. I don't think Miller Moss is going to replicate Caleb Williams numbers. I don't think Nussmeier, especially in this first week with a lot of new receivers, I don't think this passing attack is going to be as explosive as people think. Because, and again, a lot of it is just scheme, that it's a lot simpler. But I think LSU is weirdly going to be more adapted with the experience they have because those new players are all actually very experienced guys to win the shootout in a close one. But it won't shock me. It won't shock me at all if this is a loss. And I almost feel like Vegas, that 4.5 point spread for LSU is almost daring people to bet LSU. And I think this is a much more even matchup than a lot of people want to admit. So 34-31 is my pick, LSU. And again, it's week one. I don't know what I don't know. None of us have seen most of these guys play a live game, and we certainly haven't seen too much of it. So you never know. It takes a few weeks to figure out, but that's what makes college football fun. And this is just my guess on what I can deal with on paper and what I can figure out on film. And otherwise, thanks, guys. We'll see you when you see you. Have a great week, and God bless.